I call to order the 14th meeting of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. The conference will now continue its consideration of Agenda Item 9 in Cluster 1, the preamble, and in the course of the afternoon we will also begin consideration of Agenda Item 9 of Cluster 2, general obligations. So I'd like now to give the floor to those delegations which would like to make general comments with regard to preamble, particularly those issues which they consider not to have been considered in the 14 paragraphs that are originally in the document. So I'd like to give the floor to the delegation of the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And first, allow me to thank you for your flexibility and the opportunity to make these additional points on para 1 to 5. On para 1, while highly appreciating the reference to humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, we would suggest to make an effort to stay in line with existing consensus NPT language. From our perspective, the paragraph would be improved and would be more broadly acceptable by omitting the words, quote, under any circumstances, at the end of the sentence. On para 2, as stated in our previous remarks, we are concerned that any reference to aspects relating to international security and stability is lacking in the current text, and addressing these issues is an important condition for progress on disarmament and essential in securing support of a broader group of states. The second preambular paragraph would offer an appropriate location to address these issues by including a clear reference to the NPT and the importance of security aspects of nuclear disarmament. And furthermore, we could support previous suggestions made, and I refer especially to our colleague from Sweden, made to improve the reference to gender aspects in this paragraph. On para 5, we would like to bring the text of the paragraph in line with the relevant 1996 ICJ opinion, and we will look forward to see and assess the proposals to improve the content and effect of this paragraph. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I'd like to thank the delegation of the Netherlands. I give now the floor to Algeria, to be followed by Switzerland and Thailand.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm not going to make a general observation on the preamble. I would like to mention that my delegation is highly appreciated if you can include the new paragraph, PP, concerning the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And in this case, however, just to let you know that my delegation is flexible for where to place this paragraph in the PPs. We are flexible in whatever the placement is. I'm just going to read the new PP. Reads as follows: reaffirming that measures of disarmament must be consistent with the inalienable right of all states without discrimination to develop, acquire, and use nuclear technology, equipment, and materials for the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and to determine their peaceful nuclear programs in accordance with their national priorities, needs, and interests, bearing in mind the need to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. This, full stop, this is the paragraph. It comes from the outcome document of SSOD1. It's OP 36. For us, it is regarding the peaceful of energy. We consider it as a sovereign and inalienable right to the states to develop their national capacities to use this kind of energy for peaceful purposes in order to contribute to the economy and social development of the states. I thank you very much, Madam.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to Algeria. I give the floor now to the delegation of Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the opportunity to raise some last points before closing this cluster of the preamble. I would just like to flag that very much along the lines of the distinguished delegate of Algeria, we would see some value in adding some general recognition, let's say, in the preamble that the treaty should not constrain the legitimate interests in a number, so going beyond just the peaceful use of nuclear energy in a number of areas. This is, of course, the legitimate use of nuclear energy, as just mentioned by Algeria, but also the cooperation in other areas like trade, research, etc. Military cooperation, of course, is one of them, as we see some legitimacy of security cooperation that should be not restrained by this treaty. I don't have, for the time being, text or wording language to propose, but we can come back if you think it's useful. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the delegation of Thailand, to be followed by Brazil and Cuba. Thailand.
Thank you, Madam President. Just as an overall a remark, we would like to echo delegations who advocated stressing the humanitarian side of this preamble. We, in Thailand, we think this angle of human rights is very important. The victims of nuclear weapons, they deserve protection and should enjoy their rights regardless of whether or how they have been affected. Also, we would like to underline the importance of the issue of environmental protection and remediation. We view this from the perspective of sustainable development. It is our moral, social, and economic obligation to work towards the improvement of human lives and their livelihoods, which for us translate into the need to ensure the protection of their surroundings. Therefore, a stronger language in paragraphs 2 and 3 on these aspects would be desirable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Thailand. I now give the floor to the delegation of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In fact, we were going to make the exact same proposal that was made by Algeria on the inalienable right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. We think this is a critical element that needs to be in the treaty to make it clear that the right that is recognized in several treaties, not just the NPT, on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy for several different purposes is not hampered by the Prohibition Treaty. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to Brazil. The delegation of Cuba has the floor, to be followed by Nigeria. Cuba. Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving my delegation the floor. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. My delegation would like to make 2 proposals for paragraphs. These are new paragraphs, 14. Basically, President, to highlight the fact that in implementing and designing instruments of disarmament, we should respect also the environmental agreements. So we propose paragraph 14 bis, which says as follows in English.
So the need to comply with relevant environmental norms in the implementation of this convention.
Now, this proposal, Madam President, is based on operative paragraph 1 of GA Resolution 7160. It was a consensus-based resolution of the GA, and my delegation believes that it would be very useful that in the preamble to this convention, that reference should be made. Now, the other delegation, the other resolution that we'd like to submit is very closely linked to what was said by Algeria and Brazil, basically in order to highlight that nothing in this convention should violate the inalienable rights of states to the peaceful use of nuclear power. So the language of the proposal from Cuba is as follows in English.
Emphasizing that nothing in this convention should be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of its states parties to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President.
Le agradezco.
I'd like to thank the delegation of Cuba. We have now the delegation of Nigeria, who has asked for the floor. Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President. It is just to broadly endorse the proposal by the delegate of Algeria on the issue of peaceful uses. And we particularly love the reference to SSOD1. And then just to also say that the readout by Cuba on the appropriate language will be studied as well. But it appears they are all falling in line. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation. The delegation of South Africa has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to colleagues. My delegation would like to add its voice of support to the proposal as made by Algeria, Brazil, and Cuba. And we particularly would look, interestingly, the addition by Cuba. And we will take your request, Madam President, that we will submit our portion together with the ones from Brazil and Cuba. We will try and see if we can agree together, and then we'll submit something to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the delegation of South Africa. There are no further delegations requesting to take the floor. Oh, yes, we have two delegations requesting the floor. Mexico to be followed by Iran. Mexico.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. We would simply like to support what was said by the delegations of Algeria, Cuba, and Brazil concerning the appropriate inclusion here of a reference to the peaceful uses of nuclear power.
Muchas gracias. México tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. Mexico, Iran to be followed by Venezuela. Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, since we are still considering the preambular part, I would like to make this short comment regarding the title of the document. I would like to support the view expressed by South Africa regarding the title of the treaty, this document. I think treaty is more relevant to this document than convention or anything else. On the peaceful use of nuclear energy, I do support Cuba and others who suggested to have a paragraph in preambular part, but I think since this issue is very important, according to that paragraph that we are going to insert in the preambular part, we need to have one paragraph in the operational part in the commitments of states. Thank you. Then later on we will discuss that.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the delegation of Venezuela to be followed by Indonesia. Venezuela.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon to all colleagues. Our delegation would also like to add our voice to the support expressed by Algeria and Brazil and Cuba This concerns the inclusion of a paragraph that would refer to the inalienable right of all states to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Delegation of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. Just as a general remarks on the preamble part, I'll keep it short. I think what we have been listening thus far since yesterday has been very constructive, and I think we would rely on your judgment and wisdom on how to construct the preamble part. But I do appeal to you that once once the draft on the preamble are being put together, I do appeal to you to keep in mind on the need to delegitimize nuclear weapons as an object, as well as delegitimizing nuclear deterrence as a concept. So that's my general statement on the preamble part. And secondly, I'm sorry to take this floor again to use this opportunity to. I had a language that was proposed based on the Irish new paragraph on 14 bis, and I think I have a wording for you to consider, and that is to recognize the importance of disarmament education in all its aspects, and of the awareness raising on the risk and consequences of nuclear weapons for current and future generation. And my proposal would be, after that, including through the commemoration of the International Day of the total elimination of nuclear weapon on 26 September. I would be happy to provide them in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. Now it does appear that we have come to the end of the list of speakers. And so we can now give the floor to the organizations of civil society for a 15-minute section. So we'll begin with Ms. Lynette Gaillou, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Madam President, the preamble, we believe, must clearly convey the enormous and ever-increasing risk that nuclear weapons, through their very existence, pose to all humankind. This risk will remain until the weapons have been completely eradicated. The preamble must, moreover, acknowledge the inability of the international community to render any meaningful humanitarian relief in the aftermath of a nuclear detonation, a key conclusion of the 3 humanitarian conferences. The draft language on the gendered impacts of nuclear explosions should be broadened to reflect more accurately recent research findings in this area. Such impacts have a social, economic, cultural, as well as physical dimension. It is important, too, that the preamble recognize the disproportionate impact that nuclear testing has had and continues to have on indigenous communities around the world. Their lands, rivers, and oceans have been poisoned. They have been permanently displaced from their homes, disconnected from their way of life and culture, in addition to their lives being ruined. State parties should resolve in the preamble to do their utmost to provide assistance to all victims of nuclear weapons and to remediate all environments affected by the use, testing, and development of nuclear weapons. They should stress that in a world where basic human needs have not yet been met, the vast resources allocated to the manufacture and modernization of nuclear arsenals must be directed towards social and economic development. They should welcome the broad support for the international norms prohibiting other indiscriminate weapons, including biological weapons, chemical weapons, anti-personnel landmines, and cluster munitions. They should emphasize the desirability of attracting the adherence of all states to the treaty and express their determination to work strenuously towards the promotion of its universalization and full implementation. Above all else, we hope that the preamble will be more powerfully conveyed to the world our collective unequivocal rejection not only of the use of nuclear weapons, but also of their mere possession by any state. Madam President, nuclear weapons serve no legitimate purpose whatsoever, given their indiscriminate nature, inherent immorality, and potential to annihilate humanity. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Gayu and give the floor to Ms. Karina Lester from International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
Thank you for this opportunity, Madam President. My name's Karina Lester. I'm a second-generation nuclear test survivor from the Arango, Bidjanyara, Yankunytjatjara lands in South Australia. My father, Yami Lester, was blinded by the British nuclear tests conducted at Emu Field on the 15th of October 1953. Many of his people, his family, developed eye infections and skin infections, cancers, genetic problems and respiratory problems, and autoimmune diseases. And many are still suffering today. The emotional, mental, and physical suffering is felt by generations, from my grandparents, from my father, my generation, my children, and my grandchildren. We are constantly reminded of what has taken away from us as a family and the suffering we have gone through. Today I represent those Aboriginal people who have died and suffered from those British nuclear tests in the outback of South Australia between 1953 and 1963. I am here to voice my strong support for the proposal to include a paragraph in the preamble that recognises the disproportionate impact of nuclear tests on Indigenous peoples around the world. I would like to take this opportunity to read two paragraphs from an important statement that has been prepared for the conference. It has been endorsed by Indigenous groups in many countries, in particular Australia, French Polynesia, United States, Marshall Islands. And the two paragraphs I'd like to read this. We write to remind those drafting this important new treaty about the ongoing harm caused by the use of nuclear weapons and by more than 2,000 nuclear test explosions around the globe. Indigenous communities have borne the brunt of these deadly experiments. Our land, our sea, our communities, and our physical bodies carry this legacy with us now and for unknown generations to come. Our suffering cannot be undone. Our lands can never be restored. Some of our customs will never be revived and will forever remain disrupted. We hope that in this new treaty to ban nuclear weapons, governments will at last acknowledge and make reparation for the harm inflicted upon Indigenous peoples, communities, lands and sea. Your work on this treaty is a historic opportunity towards ensuring that there are no new victims of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lester. I give the floor now to Mr. Rick Wayman from Nuclear Age Peace Foundation.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam President. Nuclear deterrence, the logic it professes, and the practices it justifies are reckless, costly, and completely counterproductive to the aims of global security. We agree with Indonesia, which has highlighted the need to delegitimize nuclear deterrence as a concept. I refer you to our working paper, number 39, which presents reasons why nuclear deterrence is inadequate and flawed as a means of providing security and is antithetical to the goal of comprehensive nuclear disarmament. Relying on the constant threat of nuclear weapons use, nuclear deterrence in any form cannot coexist with the pursuit of comprehensive nuclear disarmament. Therefore, we encourage the inclusion of a clause in the preamble to the effect of, quote, understanding that nuclear deterrence is only an unproven hypothesis regarding human behavior, one that does not provide physical protection and could fail catastrophically, end quote. In addition, since nuclear deterrence constitutes an ongoing threat of nuclear weapons use, we support proposals outlined by South Africa and Iran and backed by numerous states to include the threat of use of nuclear weapons in the preamble. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Wayman and give the floor to Ms. Jacqueline Cavazo from Western States Legal Foundation.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me first say clearly that the draft preamble is already in very good shape and has a number of essential elements which should be retained. We would, however, suggest several additional elements. I refer you for more detail to IALANA Working Paper 37, Prohibitions and the Preamble. Regarding the fourth preambular paragraph on principles of international humanitarian law, we urge reference to the principle of distinction and the associated prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, and to the principle of precaution. See our working paper for proposed paragraph. We are doubtful about referring to rules involving a balancing test, such as proportionality in attack, and the prohibition of the infliction of unnecessary suffering. They open the way to making the case for the lawfulness of particular attacks. A preambular paragraph should be added, quote, recalling the duty of states to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law, end quote. This principle is drawn from Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions and is today considered customary in nature. It applies not only to actual armed conflict, but also to the planning or preparatory phases. It additionally weighs against threat of nuclear attack, which negates respect for international humanitarian law, whether or not a nuclear attack is executed. We very strongly support including a prohibition of threat of use of nuclear weapons in the obligations, and this should be reflected in the preamble as well. The illegality of threatened use is well grounded in existing law, as explained in our working paper. We also recommend a preambular paragraph on international human rights law, for example, quote, recognizing that the use of nuclear weapons would violate fundamental human rights, above all, the right to life, close quote. The catastrophic consequences of use of nuclear weapons vastly exceed the ordinary boundaries of armed conflict. Reference to human rights, as well as IHL, is highly appropriate and would help with public education. In the third preambular paragraph of the draft convention, IALANA suggests addition of a reference to production of nuclear weapons, as the effects of the entire life cycle of producing nuclear weapons, as well as testing and using them, have harmed people in large numbers. I'm sorry, I don't have my second page. 1 second. It's very short. Okay. IALANA suggests addition of the word climate to the second preambular paragraph of the draft convention on catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons. For example, quote, pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, and climate, close quote. This would link to the evidence presented at the conferences on humanitarian impact of the global cooling and consequent famine that would result from a large-scale exchange of nuclear weapons devastating many cities, and facilitate public attention on the subject. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Cavazo and give the floor to Ms. Emily Welty from the World Council of Churches.
Thank you, Madam President. The World Council of Churches has continually expressed moral and ethical concern about the nuclear age, calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons, accompaniment of affected people, and care for creation that has been abused by nuclear weapons production, use, and testing. In 2014, a WCC statement asserted that to use the energy of the atom in ways that threaten and destroy life is a sinful misuse of God's creation. We are called to live in ways that protect life instead of putting it at risk. The WCC and other NGOs endorsing this statement thus celebrate the draft text's mindfulness of the suffering of victims, especially the Habakasha. Victims and survivors have been key voices of public conscience that have brought us to this process. We must honor their rights and contributions. We welcome the preamble's acknowledgement of the impact of nuclear weapons on the environment and the requisite need to protect it. This is an important normative step. However, there is room for improvement. The preamble must establish clear normative foundations on which to build strong positive obligations that address the humanitarian harm of nuclear weapons, recognize rights, remediate contaminated environments, and promote the norms of the treaty. Our ethical and moral obligation to address unacceptable harms mean that the people affected by nuclear weapons should be treated not as objects of pity, but as holders of human rights. Vulnerability to the impact of nuclear weapons is not uniform, and we highlight the particular threat such weapons pose to gender equality and the rights of indigenous peoples. Specifically referencing the rights of indigenous peoples in the preamble will ensure that the collective rights of indigenous communities are considered, as well as the rights of the individuals affected. The current draft preamble also neglects the potential contributions of environmental law. As a result, we call on this conference to include references to human rights law and environmental law in the finalized preamble. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Welty, and now I give the floor to Mr. Kimiaki Kawai, the Soka Gakkai International.
Thank you, Madam President. I speak on behalf of Soka Gakkai International, SGI, a global grassroots network of Buddhists and international partner of ICANN. We believe the convention text can be further strengthened by expanding the frame of reference to highlight its reference to the lives of all people, whether they live in the nuclear weapon states or non-nuclear weapon states. The following are our specific proposal to be considered for incorporation. The preamble expresses deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use. This could be stated in even broader and more comprehensive terms by including reference to international human rights law, in particular, the right to life. For example, the following could be added after the paragraph 7, bearing also in mind the inherent right to life, which is declared in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We also feel that the preamble could be strengthened by more explicit acknowledgement of the non-material impacts of nuclear weapons on the human person and human dignity. To this end, we would like to propose an additional preambular paragraph, noting that the continued existence of nuclear weapons hampers people's ability to envisage a hopeful future and thus threatens human dignity, one of the principal objects of protection under international humanitarian law. In closing, although the convention is to be adopted by states, it could be argued that it should be rightfully be adopted in the name of all humankind. To this end, we'd like to propose a modification to paragraph 10 as follows. Determined to act toward that end in the name of humanity. Other proposals can be found in a working paper SGI submitted to the conference, which is available as NGO Working Paper 25. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Kawai, and finally we give the floor to Mr. Jonathan Granoff, the Global Security Institute.
Chair, delegates, friends, we call on governments to welcome civil society more explicitly. I'm speaking not only on behalf of the Global Security Institute, but also the Parliament of the World Religions as its ambassador for nuclear disarmament. We thus suggest the following paragraph: welcoming and encouraging the engagement of civil society in education and advocacy to obtain a nuclear weapons-free world, we call upon all governments to actively support such efforts. At the last General Assembly, a resolution, an extremely unique, important resolution, was adopted, taking the elimination of nuclear weapons above geopolitics and placing it squarely upon universal moral footing. The ethical imperative for a nuclear weapons-free world, 7155, very much like the resolution that convenes us here today, Resolution 71258, was not obtained by consensus, but by a vast majority of the world's nations. And it states in relevant part in its declaration, and I quote, "Given their indiscriminate nature and potential to annihilate humanity, nuclear weapons are inherently immoral." Recently, Archbishop Desmond Tutu addressed this core issue, and he said, "The development and stockpiling of weapons of mass destruction by any state is morally indefensible. It breeds enmity, distrust, and threatens peace. Further arms races and provocations will lead us inexorably to catastrophe." We all understand that deterrence is not an abstract endeavor, but involves making thousands of people ready to annihilate humanity. It rests on making the threat to use nuclear weapons present, credible, and real. To rest global security on such flawed moral footing is the pinnacle of folly. To quote the most renowned realist in geopolitics, George Kennan, he said, "The readiness to use nuclear weapons against other human beings, against people we do not know, whom we've never seen, and whose guilt or innocence is not for us to establish, and in doing so, to place in jeopardy the natural structure upon which all civilization rests, as though the safety and perceived interests of our own generation were more important than everything that has taken place or could take place in civilization, this is nothing less than a presumption, a blasphemy, an indignity of monstrous dimensions offered to God. If the knowing annihilation of civilization is not considered morally unacceptable, then what moral standards could apply to anything? Thus, we suggest the following inclusion in the preamble. Asserting that, that given their indiscriminate nature and potential to annihilate humanity, nuclear weapons are inherently immoral, and condemning the immorality of knowingly causing or threatening to cause irreparable environmental damage, devastating climatic change, or horrific suffering and death to countless non-combatants through the use of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Le agradezco al señor.
I thank Mr. Granoff and all of the other speakers for their contributions from civil society organizations. I'd also like to thank all delegations for their reflections and proposals on this first part of our initial read-through of the text. We've obviously seen there are very many areas of convergence, and so it should be fairly easy to incorporate all of these comments in the text and consolidate the text. However, there were a significant number of proposals for new paragraphs, but it still remains our intention to keep working on this once we have a revised version of the preamble by Monday afternoon, and we hope by then we'll been able to have captured all of the comments that have been made. And then we'll proceed with the preamble next week, as per our plan of work. So I'm very happy to say now that I think we can move on to the first reading of Thematic Group 2, Cluster 2, General Obligations. And before we start, I'd like to make some introductory comments with regard to the methodology and the wording of Article 1. Allow me to say, first and foremost, that the wording reflects comments that were made by the delegations at the March meeting. The design of the paragraph also respects the aspirations and common goals that were expressed at that first session. The general obligations, as they were expressed by member states in their aspirations, should be as exhaustive as possible. They should not be discriminatory, and they should be aimed at lasting into the future. A very significant number of the aspirations that were mentioned at the first session in March are related to being able to work on an instrument that one day could be universally accepted by everyone, and therefore it needs to be adequately designed to meet that objective. This means that it's important to consider, for example, with regard to one of the obligations that exists in other instruments, particularly the NPT, it's important to recall that currently there are a number of obligations that only apply to NPT members that do not possess nuclear weapons. But obligations in the future will have to apply to other states as well. It's also important to reflect whether if a nuclear weapon state decided to get rid of its nuclear weapons, how would that be reflected in these provisions and aspirations that were expressed by member states? That those states in that case would be subject to the same non-proliferation rules as those states that do not possess nuclear weapons. And in order to avoid leaving any kind of gap, the draft text has also included the general obligations of the NPT, the CNTBT, and the treaties on NWFZs. In all circumstances, the specific provisions of the draft relate directly to the proposals that were made by delegations in March, and we've been very specific about this. And as part of this introduction on the general obligations, I'd also like to refer to a question that was put yesterday with regard to the distinction between paragraphs 1 and 2. Well, of course, the conference will decide on the scope of the general obligations. The current draft refers to, does not want to undermine the provisions of other instruments, and therefore we have tried to reflect the language that is used in those other instruments. This means that we've drawn a distinction on the one hand between those acts where state parties have negative assurances, must meet negative assurances, and on the other hand, where member states undertake to prohibit and prevent certain acts. These are reflected in these two paragraphs. Another issue was also raised with regard to why 1D only refers to the use of nuclear weapons and not other explosive nuclear artifacts, devices. As a lot of you know, other explosive devices, nuclear devices, was included in the NPT to deal with possible nuclear devices for peaceful purposes. But in the light of the CBT, those devices would be prohibited now under paragraph E, paragraph 1 of the Convention. Clearly, the language in Article 1 is language that's familiar to delegations, and therefore I'd now like to proceed to a read-through of these general obligations. In order to speed up this read-through, I propose that we open the floor for comments on paragraph 1, and once we've completed that, we'll move on to paragraph 2. And then after that, I'll give the floor to delegations that would like to make proposals on issues which they feel are not reflected in either of those two paragraphs. We already have a list of speakers. We have, I'll give you the first 5: Cuba, Indonesia, Costa Rica, Palestine, Argentina, Thailand. I give the floor to the delegation of Cuba.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In a few moments, Cuba will ask to take the floor to introduce some proposed amendments on Article 1. But I do apologize. My intended statement was to come back to the preamble for a moment. Since we've concluded the first reading of your draft preamble, we do take note, Madam President, of your intention to submit as soon as possible a revised version of the preamble. At the same time, as you know, during the discussions, a number of delegations have requested a compilation be distributed with the proposals that have been submitted. Some proposals have been presented here in the room. We understand that other delegations have decided not to do so, but they are sending directly to you proposed language on a number of paragraphs. Of course, in this case, we are not aware of what those proposals are that are being made. In the view of the Cuban delegation, it would be very useful, this compilation, as a tool to facilitate the negotiations once we have your revised draft preamble. In specific terms, my question is, when can we hope to have the compilation of the proposals submitted by delegations, both those submitted in the room and those submitted directly to you on the preamble? Thank you, Madam President. Yes, I'd like to thank the delegation of Cuba for that question. In fact, I want to make this following clarification. It's clear that the proposed wording and new language should be considered in the plenary, so that delegations that have taken the floor to put forward the proposals that should be done in the plenary, and they're indicating that they will send them by email. So we will compile all the proposals. But as we see it, all the proposals can be considered, need to be submitted in the plenary, and all delegations need to be informed in that manner of them.
Adelante.
Go ahead.
Embajador.
Ambassador, you have the floor.
Cuba tiene la palabra.
Cuba has the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Madam President, for that answer. I apologize. I repeat this question and for clarification. When will we have that compilation?
Precisamente.
So what I was saying that is we will produce this compilation so that we'll have this ready for the second part of our working day on Monday. So I now give the floor to the delegation of Costa Rica to comment on Article 1. This is general obligations. Thank you very much, Madam President. My delegation believes that Article 1 is the most solid basis in this text. We reassert our commitment to the prohibitions that are imposed on states. This delegation would just like to propose an amendment. In the actions that are prohibited, we should include the obligation to destroy, and this would make the text more coherent, since Article 5 assumes that a power with nuclear arms enters into the treaty needs to have a plan for destruction within a specific deadline. We believe this obligation to destroy must be assimilated in paragraph 2 of the treaty, but we are flexible on how this should be integrated in the text, Madam President. I'd like to thank Costa Rica. I now give the floor to the delegation of Indonesia, to be followed by Palestine, Argentina, and others.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for the explanation as well as the briefing to all of us concerning the general obligation, in particular Article 1. Madam President, we have a few amendments. This would begin in paragraph 1D, and that would be consistent with our previous proposals and also previous proposals made by other delegations in our attempt to delegitimize the concept of nuclear deterrence. So I would propose for paragraph 1D to add or threat of use. So it would read as follows: use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. That is for 1D. And for 1F, I would propose a new word after encourage, and that word is finance. So it would read as follows: assist, comma, encourage, comma, finance, comma, or induce, and so on and so forth. The rationale being that there is always any attempts to finance nuclear programs, in particularly to non-state actors. And I think this is something that we need to also pay our close attention to. And Madam Chair, we have also one new proposal of a subparagraph, and it would be located between paragraph 1D and 1E, and it concerns an act of any state that would engage in military preparations for the use of nuclear weapons. And this paragraph would read as follows: to engage in any military preparations to use nuclear weapons. Madam Chair, I think this paragraph is also consistent with existing treaties. I recall there is a treaty on the Convention on Chemical Weapons, in particular Article 1, also in the general obligation part, which states that to engage in any military preparations to use chemical weapons. So those are my proposals, Madam President. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. If I may, I'd like to read out the list of requests to take the floor using the old-fashioned paper technology. We have Palestine, Argentina, Thailand, Ireland, Netherlands, Indonesia, Guatemala, Cuba, Liechtenstein, Kazakhstan, Brazil, Ecuador, and Philippines, in that order. So let's continue now with Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, we were taking the floor for two of the same recommendations that were made by Indonesia about the threat of use and about the military preparations to use nuclear weapons, which was in the Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and also part of the recommendations we received from the ICRC. We would also suggest the addition of the obligation to destroy nuclear arsenals states own or possess, or that is located in any place under its jurisdiction or control. We believe that is in line with the objective of nuclear disarmament and clarifies the text. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. La declaración del Estado.
Thank you very much to the State of Palestine. Argentina has the floor. Thank you, Madam President, for introducing the Article 1 general obligations. Argentina believes that it would be good to merge the two headings of 1 and 2 because that would not in any way change the general obligations. Merging these two headings would reflect what we do in other instruments and would reflect the logic of the CBT obligations. So we'd like paragraph 1 to say each state party
in its territory or at any place under its jurisdiction or control, never under any circumstances to. Respecto al punto D.
With regard to D, we agree with the proposal to include the threat of use. To not include it would not be a convincing argument, and it wouldn't be reflecting any of the humanitarian goals of the Charter. We do mention this as well in the preamble, and it's also mentioned in the advisory opinion of the ICJ. as I understood, you want us to go down to G, correct, in this first part? Okay, well, after that, we have some new paragraphs that we would like to include. We'll come back to that later. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. La delegación de Tailandia.
Thank you very much. Thailand has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank you for this very solid draft Article 1, which is a very good basis to work on. As a matter of principle, Thailand believes that this treaty, the prohibition part of this treaty, must be at least in line with those of prohibitions under the Bangkok Treaty for Southeast Asia nuclear-free zone. They must cover all acts committed by any person or entity, and not only the state party. Acts that are related to or associated with nuclear weapons within the states parties' territories, continental shelves, and exclusive economic zones, as well as any other areas that are under their jurisdiction or control. It is important that each state party undertakes not to commit these acts, but also important that they undertake not to allow any person or entity to commit them in any place that is under their sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control. And we believe that the express reference to the continental shelf and exclusive economic zone is essential to ensure absolute clarity of the scope of the prohibitions. It is also important to prohibit seeking or receiving any assistance, as well as any action to assist and encourage the commission of any act prohibited under the treaty. When it comes to concrete suggestion, first I can support the proposal by Indonesia regarding a threat of use of nuclear weapon and financing and military preparations in the terms that Indonesia has proposed. And in addition to that, Thailand has some suggestion on paragraph 1, subparagraph A. We would like to propose adding the terms have control, store, station, or transport. Have control, store, station, or transport. Article 1(1)(a). For paragraph 2, we would like to propose adding the terms continental shelf, exclusive economic zone after the word territory. So the chapeau would read, each state party undertakes to prohibit and prevent in its territory, continental shelf, exclusive economic zone, or at any other place under its jurisdiction or control. We also would like to propose extension of this prohibition that the state party must ensure. In subparagraph A, we would like to add development, production, manufacturing, acquisition, possession, control, stockpiling, storing, use or threat of use. May I go through that again, Madam President? Development, production, manufacturing, acquisition, possession, control, stockpiling, storing, use or threat of use. Being understood that this paragraph 2 is for other entities than the state party itself. And then we would like to suggest a third paragraph regarding assistance or action to assist or encourage. I would like to read it out, but we can supply a written version to you. So paragraph 3 would read, each state party undertakes not to A. Seek or receive any assistance on the commission of any act in violation of the provisions of paragraphs 1 and 2 of this article, semicolon, or B. Take any action to assist or encourage the commission of any act in violation of paragraphs 1 and 2 of this article. To make things simple, this suggestion comes from the Sean-Face Agreement, the last paragraph of Article 3. So you can look at that. And that is all we have to suggest, Madam President. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished ambassador of Thailand. Delegation of Ireland has the floor, followed by the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. I think, as you said in your introduction, we're all somewhat familiar with this text, so I think we can be rather succinct. Maybe before we get to the subparagraphs, I think in the chapeau, even though the first line of Article 1 already includes the words "under any circumstances," we feel it might be useful to add the words "at any time" here as a strong signal that these undertakings apply at all times, even during times of war or conflict. I'm thinking here, I suppose, of the prohibitions at 1B and 1C. Moving along to 1E, we welcome 1E and also 2B, which is very similar. And we note the helpful use of the language taken from CTPT. We are content with this reference and are not looking for any elaboration of it at this time. Similarly with 1F, and here I might stress at this time, we're not seeking a further elaboration of the article, and we'll be looking at the relationship between financing as a component of assistance in this regard. But we may come back to you on this later on. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. La delegación de Irlanda.
Thank you very much, Ireland, the Netherlands, followed by Guatemala and Cuba.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will make 3 comments. First, on the sub-item E, any reference to nuclear weapon test explosions should contain a clear and indubitable cross-reference to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, in our view. We could support proposals which create compatibility between this ban and the CTBT, such as the inclusion of provisions requiring ratification of the CTBT. Second, the draft text generally does not provide many definitions, and in this article in particular we would wish to obtain and include clarification of the proposed terms: transfer, assist, encourage, induce, stationing and installation. And thirdly, as previously stated, the text of Article 1 as it currently stands contains elements that are incompatible with our NATO commitments. And in order to amend this situation, we propose to include a temporal dimension in this provision in a new and separate sub-article to bring the provisions in line with the inherent chronology in Article 6 of the NPT. I thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of the Netherlands. Delegation of Guatemala has the floor. Thank you, Madam President. With regard to Article 1 in the general obligations, first of all, we'd like to request clarification with regard to the term used in 1A. We think we should remove, just say test and not test explosion. That could cover, that would be a broader term and would cover more things. Secondly, as was mentioned by Indonesia and Palestine and others, we would also like clarification as to why we didn't include the threat of the use or transit. These are things that appear in other instruments, including the Tlatelolco Convention, and we think it's necessary in order for the convention to be as complete as possible. In particular, the prohibition of the threat of use would assist with nuclear deterrence. And we feel that we should also include the prohibition to finance and design nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Guatemala.
Thank you very much, Guatemala. The delegation of Cuba, followed by Liechtenstein and Kazakhstan. Thank you very much, Madam President. My delegation would like to thank you for the general introduction that you gave us with regard to the general obligations contained in Article 1. And we'd also like to make some drafting proposals. In paragraph 1A, we'd like to include after develop,
research, y después de possess,
and after possess, retain. My delegation feels that in order to have a general prohibition, we should include prohibition of design, of research, and the possession of nuclear weapons, and use the language that we currently have. During the first session that was held in March, my delegation did say that we should prohibit the design, research, and the retention of nuclear weapons. And then in 1D, my delegation, as Indonesia and the State of Palestine have also said, my delegation would like to make the proposal to prohibit the threat of use. So our proposal would be use, as it is at the moment, and add or threaten to use. For us, this proposal is very important, and otherwise we would be legitimizing the threat of use, and that would be unacceptable to us. The text would say that. So we want to prohibit the threat of use. And then in 1E, my delegation also has a proposal for an addition after weapon test, comma, including by. My delegation feels that the current wording of 1E is incomplete, is insufficient, because it would only be prohibiting nuclear explosions, and that would be legitimizing other kinds of tests, such as carried out by the nuclear powers, these computer tests that they carry out. So my delegation feels that all tests should be prohibited, including the critical computer tests. That's why we want to include including by after test and before explosion. And in doing this, we're trying to avoid the scope of the convention being affected, or the standards that relate to the total banning of nuclear tests in any way being diminished. Thank you. Thank you very much to the delegation of Cuba, the delegation of Liechtenstein now, followed by Kazakhstan and Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me the floor, and also in particular for the explanation that you gave introducing this paragraph, which is obviously the core paragraph of our treaty. Given your explanation, we certainly take note that much reflection has gone into the proposal that you've put forward, and I'm mainly taking the floor to support your draft in the elements that you've proposed. I think you strike a very good and careful balance between the ambition that we should have and the pragmatism also, bearing in mind that we should aim at a text that is conducive to universality, as you said yourself. To be clear, my delegation has also proposed additional elements that we could add to this text in the March session, but I will refrain from bringing them back here because I believe that we had a very good discussion and we have made a very good step forward with your proposal. That being said, let me just make a couple of comments on the structure of the text, and that is first and foremost questions that we've asked ourselves studying this proposal. The first one would be regarding subparagraph C, whether there might be a possibility to maybe even more streamline the text here and combine it with subparagraph B. I don't have a drafting proposal, but that would be something that we would look at positively. The other comment we had would be we would support if there's a willingness in the room to move subparagraph D up to the beginning of the paragraph, because it strikes us as a very important subparagraph and would be a good start into that prohibition article. We would also look favorably at what has been proposed by Argentina, namely to maybe get rid of the subdivision in this paragraph. And in our view, if this is possible without losing any of the any of the meaning on the elements and the scope of the elements, we would favor that. But we don't have a drafting proposal to that either, but we would support an effort to that effect. That's it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Liechtenstein. I now give the floor to Kazakhstan, to be followed by Brazil, Ecuador, and the Philippines. Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam President. We support the proposal of adding into subparagraph D the threat of use of nuclear weapons. And in this regard, we propose also to broaden the wording for subparagraph D as following: use or threaten use of nuclear weapons, including the conduct of some military and other preparations for such use. And we also support an exclusion of possible financing for developing of nuclear weapons, and therefore we would like to submit the following wording of as a new subparagraph: fund any research in the field of nuclear weapons, with the exception of research in the field of nuclear disarmament. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to the delegation of Brazil, to be followed by Ecuador and the Philippines and Chile. Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I think there are some proposals that we have not fully captured, but we think may be interesting. I would like to refer to the Argentinian proposal of rationalization between 1 and 2 by changing the chapeau of 1 in the way that was proposed to include in any place, etc. I don't have the exact wording, but that might be a positive amendment in terms of streamlining and rationalization of 1 and 2. We would like to support also the inclusion of threat of use and D, as has been proposed and supported by many. We share the concern of Cuba in respect of test explosion, which we find an expression that seems to me to be a dilution or narrowing down of what currently is there in the CTBT. And of course, if we are to make any movement in that respect, we should make a movement towards greater clarity and not and greater and more broader prohibitions instead of more narrow ones. So we think the Cuban proposal goes in the direction of Brazil's concern, but we also have language to that effect that we wish to propose, which is extracted from the final document of the Article 14 conference of the CTBT from 2015. And it would read the following way. There's a slight adaptation with respect to that language to make the paragraph flow. So it would be: carry out any nuclear weapon test explosion, any other nuclear explosion, and this would be the additional part, or any other activity associated with the development and use of nuclear weapon technologies. This is not incompatible with the amendment by Cuba. Perhaps both could be taken on board, but we believe that this contributes towards greater clarity using an expression that is already contained within the CTBT as an agreed text of the final document thereto. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Brazil. Ecuador to be followed by the Philippines, Chile, New Zealand, and Austria.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Madam President. On this paragraph, on the first part, we have a number of proposals that have already been put forward by other delegations, so I'll refer to them. In 1A, as was said by Cuba, we would propose that we do include the word, the design. This is, so it would read as, design would be included in 1A. Now, for 1B and 1C, as we have said, we do believe there should be no gap. And perhaps for greater clarity in this text, it would be interesting in B and C to include the expression under any title or modality. This would, so it read as follows.
To any recipient under any title or modality whatsoever, nuclear weapons, etc.
And similarly in 1C,
transfer or control over nuclear weapons under any title, receive the transfer or control under any title or modality over nuclear weapons, etc.
In this way, it would be clear that there's no legal fiction that could allow this reference to be, that allows this reference to be included. Now, in the case of DEES, indeed, as others, particularly at the beginning, Indonesia, and then there were others who backed up what Indonesia was proposing, we should include the threat of the use of. This is in line with the Charter and the decision of the International Court of Justice, and I believe it's also in line with the intention we had when we came together to negotiate this very treaty. Then we would propose the inclusion of the expression, the prohibition of financing. We also believe that we should include a new paragraph. This would be related to initiating military preparations for the use of nuclear weapons, as is in the first article of the Convention on Chemical Weapons, and as was already proposed by Indonesia. Just one final comment, Madam President. Clearly, it would have been better to see it in writing, the proposal from Argentina on making the two sections one in this, merging these two parts of this paragraph. Yes, but if there is a difference in perspective between the first section, here we talk about the prohibitions that the state assumes for itself, and the second part, these are positive actions of prohibition under the state's jurisdiction. But if I did have a concern, and maybe at a later stage we look at the obligations of implementation nationally. So we need to know where we stand now. Clearly, the state, under this paragraph, would be obliged not to produce, for example, nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, although it's a very hypothetical situation, of course, but there also should be a prohibition of nuclear weapons for others. In the case of Ecuador, we prevent, for example, individuals under our national law in Ecuador to produce weapons. But I'm just putting on the table. We'll see how it will be in the text. So we're talking about national legislation and what should be included in this first article. For the moment, that's all. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Ecuador. I now give the floor to the delegation of the Philippines.
Madam President, the Philippines supports Indonesia's proposed paragraph 1D from use nuclear weapons to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons. This is consistent with the call for negative security assurance, which cover both use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. We also, in paragraph 1F, we support the inclusion of financing as one of the activities state parties shall never undertake under any circumstance. Then we go to paragraph 2. We support Thailand's proposed inclusion of the continental shelf and EEZ, as well as its proposed paragraph 3, which are all covered under the Bangkok Treaty. Thank you, Madam President.
La delegación de
The delegation of Chile, to be followed by New Zealand, Austria, and Iran. Chile.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. On the first Article 1, General Obligations, we'd like to include an element. We agree with what was said by Cuba and the delegation of Ecuador on including the expression, the word design. Also, following the word possess, we'd like to include the word deploy. And after the word stockpile, we'd like to add maintain and modernize. We believe that this ensures the broadest possible coverage here, and we agree with Indonesia's proposal to include the threat of the use under B's. That's all. Thank you very much. Thank you to the delegation of Chile. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And certainly my delegation supports your general approach outlined in Article 1 in terms of the substantive obligations you have incorporated. We do have some comments to make, though, on your general structure and approach that's been followed in terms of layout in Article 1. We're aware of some comment outside the room regarding the duplication of some of the prohibitions, and I think this arises largely from the incorporation of NPT language in subparagraph B and C, and which has led to perhaps something of a duplication with some of the other subparagraphs. My delegation is not at all worried, however, about the possibility of overlap. We think that's of much less concern than an underlap. So in general, we welcome your listing, but we don't really understand the basis for the repetition, which seems to us to occur in paragraph 1E and then repeated in 2B. And we suspect, Madam President, that that's come about because of this construct that you have used, this bifurcation between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. We thought that the proposal put by Argentina was pretty much exactly the language that we were going to propose to get around this problem, and I didn't quite get down what Argentina was proposing, so I'd like to reiterate, it may be reiterate because she probably said the same thing, make my proposal about how we would avoid the duplication and make this article much simpler and clearer. We would suggest that the chapeau in Article 1.1 could be reworded to say, and at this point I'd like to express my support for Ireland's suggestion about including at any time in the chapeau to Article 1. So incorporating Ireland's suggestion in the New Zealand proposal, we would suggest the chapeau state, quote, each state party in its territory or at any place under its jurisdiction or control undertakes never, under any circumstances, at any time, to, and then the list would follow as set out at present, but with the addition at the end of a new subparagraph H, which would incorporate the language currently in subparagraph 2A to subparagraph 2B, and the entirety of the chapeau to paragraph 2 could then be deleted, given that the chapeau to paragraph 2 is effectively incorporated already in Article 7.2 regarding national implementation. We think, Madam President, that this would make the scope very much the same as it is at present in Article 1, but it would make it much clearer and much simpler, we think, to follow. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, New Zealand. I'd just like to ask the Secretariat to deal with some of the terminology here and the specific questions that are referring to the language that have been raised by a number of delegations. So for the Secretariat to clarify that.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like just to provide a little bit of commentary on the distinction between paragraphs 1 and 2, and to respond to the point that was just raised on the repetitive language. On the issue of nuclear testing, the language that appears respectively in paragraph 1D and in 2B come from Article 1 of the CTBT, and I'll read Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the CTBT in full. Each state party undertakes not to carry out any nuclear weapon test explosion or any other nuclear explosion, and to prohibit and prevent any such nuclear explosion at any place under its jurisdiction or control. And so the approach with the drafting in the current text separates out these two aspects of Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the CTBT, which is on the one hand the obligation of each party not to carry out any nuclear explosion or any other explosion on the one hand, and that is covered in Paragraph 1, and on the other hand in Paragraph 2, which includes the obligation to prohibit and prevent any such nuclear explosion at any place under its jurisdiction or control. And I hope this explanation is useful and clarifying the approach in the drafting. Thank you.
New Zealand would like to follow through your question?
Grateful for the Secretariat for that explanation, but it doesn't really answer my point that the aspect about prohibiting and preventing in its territory is properly addressed in the equivalent here, Article 7, which for all I know isn't actually in the CTBT. But having put in Article 7, I don't see the justification for Article 2's chapeau. And in any event, as already said by Argentina and as proposed by New Zealand, and I think with the Irish suggestion, the element about territory or at any place under its jurisdiction or control can be carried across into the chapeau of 1, and then you just have one paragraph and one simple listing. It's shorter, but it's also easier to follow. I'm delighted to hear from the Secretariat there is a rationale for 1 and 2, but if bush lawyers or other sorts of lawyers don't follow that, I'm not quite sure that it seems an effective approach. So I just invite consideration and views from others about just one paragraph and one listing. But anyway, we are in your hands, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of New Zealand. Yes, that's a valid point. And I think that Ecuador also mentioned the need when we come on to national implementation, we need to look at this together. Certainly, the reaction to Article 1 has been to try to include in one single text a mixture of provisions that we have in various instruments so that the conference can analyze them, but also analyze them in conjunction with the rest of the text of the convention. So we are going to have to come back to that point when we look at Article 7.
Tiene la palabra la delegación.
Austria has the floor, followed by Iran, Egypt, and Uganda.
Follow on what you just have said. We have to see the prohibitions in relationship to the national implementation, because for us the implementation of this treaty is the yardstick. It's not so much what we put in it, but that we really will implement it, and it has to be also verifiable. We have this morning introduced a verifiable the adjective various times. And I think your proposal actually is very good and quite clear. So what we have heard now are some proposals to break certain terms that are usual in these treaties, like in the Chemical Weapons Convention and others, further down. So, for example, design and research, in the understanding of my delegation, when it is really geared towards the development of nuclear weapons, is part of to develop. And when we now say we need, for example, research, we imply that it would not be in the other treaties subsumed under to develop. And with research as an own heading, we run then perhaps in the problem, what about basic research which is not directly related to the development of nuclear weapons, but could also be used for this because it's just basic research. So actually my delegation feels it would be better for us to follow the usual terms that are well established in similar treaties and refrain from breaking down. The same holds true for financing. We have here the prohibition to assist. So in my view, a government loan to a country in order to enable the other country to develop nuclear weapons would clearly be, of course, part of assistance. But when we now introduce finance, we have to think, what is the scope? Would it be also that it should be forbidden to sell a mixed share fund where one of the 200 different shares contained therein is an electronic company, a huge company that also, among other things, is producing certain electronic parts for nuclear weapons? I think the devil is in the detail. And of course, when we go this road, it will be very difficult because we would all have to clear this with the ministries of finance because it has to be implementable. So I think it's laudable that steps against financing are taken. Just take the example of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Under assistance, not under financing, under assistance, a number of countries have taken steps, and certainly government, pension funds, and such things. So there is the possibility to address this as long as we have assistance. And I fear when we now create a new obligation, financing, the first implication might be then assistance would not encompass this, which is not perhaps that what the delegations want to do. And secondly, nobody knows really how far it goes. And when you take it very seriously, it becomes impossible in a free market society. So I would appeal that we try, even so I fully share the good intentions, to steer clear from this because it would make it very difficult. And at the end of the day, we have to have a treaty that is verifiable because otherwise the treaty is not totally credible. Also with regard to transit, which was mentioned by one delegation, I think it was Guatemala, there's a good reason why it is not taken in, because how do we enforce this? My colleague from Thailand has rightly brought up the issue of the territorial waters, but how can you really enforce it that on a sub that passes through your territorial waters, no nuclear weapon would be? Would such a country then be in breach? Because transit is a factual thing, it's not an intentional thing. And the same holds true for all of us who have containers passing through our airports. You cannot open all containers. There might be a part for something, I don't know. So I think it would be better if we would leave this out. I also want to make a concrete proposal. And this is in B and C on transfer. I think for us it's fine, but perhaps we have to think that there might be a situation that a nuclear weapon should be transferred from a landlocked country to a destruction site outside. And so it would perhaps by rail be transferred through a country, and only for the destruction purpose, which is precisely what we want. We should perhaps have an exception, and that's easy to formulate, because otherwise we would block the destruction of nuclear weapons, which is not what we want to do. Thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación de
I thank the delegation of Austria, and I give the floor to the delegation of Iran, followed by Egypt, Uganda, Vietnam, and Mexico.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, regarding the points made by the Distinguished Ambassador of Austria, I think if we have one article regarding the definitions that we think that is needed to be inserted after this article, most of these problems will be resolved. On this article, we had a couple of suggestions that fortunately most of them have been mentioned by other distinguished delegations. but I would like to support some of them and I mean add one, two, or two new suggestions. Regarding the merging two chapeau, which was suggested by Argentina and supported by some others, I think we need more time to discuss this matter to be digested, to be digestive to us, because at this point in time, I do not have a clear picture whether we can have these two as the one chapeau or not. On subpara A, we think that retain should be mentioned there. It was suggested also by Cuba. At any time, suggested by Ireland at the beginning, somewhere in chapeau is a very good suggestion. Should be inserted. On paragraph B and C, which has been borrowed exactly from MPT, I think this insertion of this kind of wording here might be misleading, and it gives this impression that we have acknowledged two kind of states. One group are haves, one group are have-nots. Haves should not transfer, have-nots should not receive. So I think it has to be reformulated, or just simply the word of transfer should be added to the first, to subpara A, with new, of course, meaning, definition. Threaten to use, that was suggested by Indonesia and supported by others, should be mentioned there for the consistency with the preambular part. Military preparation also, financing also, and regarding the carrying out any nuclear explosion test, I do agree with Cuba that we should have including there to have this concept more broadened than CTBT. That's all, Madam President.
Muchas gracias a la
Thank you very much to the delegation of Iran. And I'll give the floor to the delegation of Egypt.
Thank you, Madam President. Just to add to the also suggested proposals by delegations, we would like to add in the general obligations of 1A the prohibition for modernization of nuclear weapons. And I also take this opportunity to go on the record in supporting some of the suggestions mentioned by several delegations. Primarily, we see merit in the suggestion by the delegation of Argentina to merge sections 1 and 2. I think it merits to be considered. We also support the suggestion made by delegation of Cuba concerning the issue to add the notion of subcritical tests in the section of nuclear explosions. The suggestion made by Kazakhstan concerning funding research for nuclear weapons, we support. And of course, we also are supportive of the suggested amendment by the delegation of Indonesia for 1D to add the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Egypt. I give the floor now to Uganda, to be followed by Vietnam, Mexico, and Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We want to register support for the Argentina proposal and the wording by New Zealand. We thought it was very good. Also, we are supporting Cuba, Indonesia on the paragraph D. On paragraph F, we are wondering whether we can add, after anyone, we can add also a group, because sometimes you're not only encouraging one person, but maybe groups of people. So our proposal there is to insert also group. We are also supporting the proposal by Indonesia on introducing a new paragraph on military preparation. Maybe you can insert also planning as part of the preparation. And then we're also supporting the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much to Uganda. Vietnam to be followed by Mexico. Vietnam.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation also support Indonesian proposal in relation to paragraph 2D, namely threat to use and military preparation. We can also support Liechtenstein proposal to move subparagraph D up to the front, since in the discussion on the preamble part, a big support was to move PP7 up, and PP7 talks about UN Charter principle, including the non-use of force and all threat to use force. We support Cuban proposal to have a broader approach to tests, and we also support Thailand proposal to the sharp hold of paragraph 2. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Vietnam. The delegation of Mexico to be followed by Nigeria, Sweden, Switzerland, Mozambique, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Mexico.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Madam President. On the proposals on 1D, for my delegation, it would be sufficient to, it would be appropriate to include the reference to use only in the preamble. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mexico. Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have just two observations. The first one, we haven't seen how the proposal by New Zealand and Ireland will read, but they say the beauty of the pudding is in the eating. So when we see it, we will know how it will read, and then what we can do to support it. And regarding 1D, we would like to add to the language we have here, and then aside from, and with due regards to the proposal by Indonesia, we can also add, and we don't want to think that it's going to be too much, to say that use, cost to use, assist to use, and threat to use nuclear weapons. Let me go over it again. It will, rather than what we have, use of nuclear weapons, it will be use, comma, cost to use, assist to use, and threat to use nuclear weapons. And secondly, Madam President, we don't mind if by the time we get 2A, and that will be in line with what we have in Pelindaba, any stationing, then we are going to add after that transporting, installation, or deployment. So the only word we're adding to that line will be after stationing, which will be transporting. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Nigeria. The delegation of Sweden.
Thank you, Madam. In our review, this is the most important article in the convention or treaty. To us, it doesn't matter if we call it convention or treaty. And I do have a number of comments and suggestions that I would also like to motivate, so you will have to listen to me for a little while. First, I would like to say that there has to be some kind of balance between obligations, implementation, and verification. Otherwise, I have the feeling that this convention or treaty will not be seen as credible. I would also be a little bit hesitant to merge 1 and 2, because 1 concerns what you do as a state party, while 2 deals with what you allow others to do on your territory. So we feel that there is a difference and that they should be separated. Now I would like to turn to 1A, and we would like to highlight a concern that we have there. And currently the verification of the obligations of state parties under Article 1.1 is limited to the safeguards under INFCIRC 153. And this is clearly not sufficient to verify that a state party is not developing covertly nuclear weapons. As the International Atomic Energy Agency itself states, and I quote, "To ascertain that there are no indications of undeclared nuclear material or activities in a state, the agency needs to have conducted a comprehensive state evaluation based on all safeguards and performed complementary access in accordance with the state's additional protocol. Thus, both comprehensive safeguards and the additional protocol is needed." As delegations might be aware, Sweden has, together with Chile and Uganda, submitted a working paper number 6, where we argue for the need to have the additional protocol as a mandatory standard for state parties. And we will submit that when we come to Article 3 of the Convention. If that is included in the Convention, namely the additional protocol, then we could have development in 1A. But if there is no strengthening of the possibility of verification, then the ban on development should be deleted from the article. That was my first comment. My second comment relates to paragraph 1E. And Sweden is one of the many state parties to the CTBT and believe that the current moratorium on nuclear testing, respected by all but one state, is of key importance. We strongly support the verification mechanism developed under that treaty, and we're happy to have a few stations of the monitoring system in our territory. But we are concerned that this convention in no way shall undermine existing conventions and mechanisms in the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament field. For the current text for subparagraph E for Article 1.1, we believe that it is drafted in a way that it may be seen as an alternative option of being a party to the CTBT, in order to ensure the primary role of the CTBT when it comes to banning, preventing, and detecting nuclear testing. We would like to see the deletion of subparagraph E. Then we come to paragraph 1F. And here I would like to amend that paragraph to read as follows, and I will explain why afterwards. We would like to amend it so that it would read, "assist with critical components and technologies, encourage or induce intentionally anyone to engage in any activity prohibited by a state party under this convention." I know that this article is copied from other international disarmament instruments, and in the context of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. But with regard to these two conventions, Sweden has long argued that the prohibition on assistance in any way by anyone to engage in any activity entails an obligation to control what individuals and organizations under your jurisdiction do. This means a need for criminal legislation and to establish national export control. In the context of a convention to prohibit nuclear weapons, the obvious target for such national export controls will be states possessing nuclear weapons. As Sweden interprets the ban on assistance, the export controls would need to be fairly comprehensive and include items and technologies such as tubes, frequency chargers, valves, heat exchangers, compressors, and many more. State parties to this convention would of course only allow exports to entities engaged in peaceful activities, but since these entities would be located in a country with an active nuclear weapons program, we believe that the type of controls needed such an enhanced end-use certificate, post-delivery visits and controls, will not only be costly for state parties to the convention, but also result in a significant disadvantage for our civilian nuclear industry and research competence and operate on the civilian market in states that possess nuclear weapons. As you may know, some of these civilian nuclear export markets are the biggest and most important in the world. A lack of access to them may result in a de facto relocation of all civilian nuclear expertise and industry to countries outside of the Convention to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. That would be the price to pay, and as for the gain, it is doubtful that such national export controls implemented faithfully by state parties to this convention would have any effect whatsoever on the nuclear weapons program of, for instance, the P5. This scenario is nothing that Sweden would like to see materialize, and indeed many other delegations have spoken out on the need to ensure that the convention will not hamper civilian legitimate nuclear activities. That is why we proposed this wording, and I'm sorry it has been a lengthy explanation, but I thought it was necessary. And also we believe that we share very much the views expressed by Austria when it comes to the issue of finance. Then I would like to suggest a new sub-paragraph after 1G, reading as follows: nothing in this article shall impede the possibility of state parties to engage individually or in cooperation with other states in peaceful nuclear activities, including for the purpose of detection, protection, non-proliferation, or civilian nuclear activities, subject to the obligations under the subparagraphs A, B, C, etc. These were my comments, Madam, and I apologize for being a bit lengthy. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the delegation of Sweden. And now I give the floor to your neighbor, the delegation of Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Madam President. My dear neighbor, the distinguished delegate of Sweden, just asked us for our indulgence. I'm afraid I have to do the same. I have a whole list of points I would like to raise. A list, by the way, that grew longer and longer the more I listened to the previous speakers. So in more general terms, I would like to welcome the Article 1 as it is. However, we think that it could be more straightforward in its structure. For instance, we are not totally convinced of the need for detailed provisions for transfer as included in 1.1b and 1.1c. This is particularly valid because we think that the two sub-paragraphs on transfer have considerable overlaps, and we do have some concerns in having overlaps. Secondly, both transferring and receiving a transfer would, in our view, necessarily violate prohibited activities under paragraph 1.1a. that is otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile. So we don't really see an added value in specifically addressed transfer. And similar reflection are valid for the prohibition to seek or receive assistance to engage in prohibited activities. Another example where we see a need for streamlining, or let's say addressing this article more straightforward, are the subparagraphs 1.2a and 1.2b. Both are without any doubt very important provisions, but we think we could, well, they could be dealt with under 1.1, and so we would support the suggestion to merge these two paragraphs, 1.1 and 1.2. I think another aspect that could be improved is to ensure that prohibitions are not leaving out key elements that are prohibited in other treaties. An example would be in 1.1a, we take note that retain is not prohibited. We are wondering why, or what considerations, what the considerations were to not include retain, as it is included in other treaties. Maybe along the same line, with regard to the prohibition of use, we note that other nuclear explosive devices are missing. I won't repeat myself with regard to CTBT, but since we have the CTBT language in this paragraph, I think we should have a clear reference to the CTBT. And here I join the Netherlands, who made the same remark, the same comment. And I thank here, by the way, ODA for its explanation. But I think it's important, again, to clearly refer to the CTBT and add something like in accordance with the CTBT. This is just out of the concern that we don't want to create a new norm different from the CTBT and a new norm without verification. In this context, again, the question is, and there I join my Swedish colleague, is whether we need to repeat on the 1.2b the issue of testing. Maybe we should delete it, but then in this case we should, or we would suggest clearer reference on or in the preamble. Then, I'm afraid I'm not finished yet. 1.1f. As I said at the end of the preamble cluster, I think it's very important that this treaty is clear on what this treaty does, but also it should be clear and spell out what is not prohibited under this treaty. So I think it would be helpful to have some language specifically on activities like the inalienable right of all states to develop, research, production and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, the right of all states to participate in exchange of equipment, materials and scientific and technological information for peaceful purposes, the legitimate security interest of all states regarding the conduct and research of and development of CBRN protection, including cooperation with states not party, and last but not least, military cooperation with states not parties to the treaty, that is cooperation and operations with states which might engage in their part in activities prohibited to a state party. For us, it's important in this context to the precise scope and implication of paragraph 1.1f is rather unclear to my delegation. The language of assist, encourage, and induce seems to have been interpreted and treated differently in the various conventions where this wording is found, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Anti-Personnel Mine Convention, and the CCM. So at this point, I would welcome if delegations could articulate in their intervention how they interpret this paragraph. This would help us to better understand what activities remain legal and which are considered prohibited under this treaty. My next point is on financing. There I would like to support very much the Austrian statement as well as the inputs by my Swedish colleague. Here the thing is, or the challenge is indeed that financing is an extremely complex issue. We do not have a principled objection against such a provision. But as Switzerland already has provisions on this issue in its own legislation, we can speak from experience, and I can indeed confirm the devil is in the detail. I think it's really important to be very clear, and we would be very well advised to have absolute clarity, as states can only contract obligations that they fully understand, otherwise compliance issues could be rapidly arise. For instance, we would need to understand what is meant by the prohibition of financing and what financing means. For instance, do we mean newly issued bonds, or also existing bonds, newly issued shares of a company, or also shares already traded on the market, etc., etc. I think the distinguished delegate from Austria made this point, and I could go on and on. The questions are indeed complex, but I think I made my point here, and again, I would support the Austrian input with this regard. I think I've gone through my list. If not, last but not least, the question of the threat of use. Here again, I would like to join the distinguished delegate from Austria. We shouldn't repeat things over and over again. I think we can implicitly mean certain prohibitions. And when it comes to the threat of use, I have some difficulties to imagine how credible threats could be possible without violating the prohibitions now already contained in Article 1A. So if I don't possess, acquire, manufacture, produce, etc., etc., any nuclear weapons, I probably will not be able to threat with them. This is all. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Switzerland. Now I give the floor to the delegation of Mozambique, to be followed by Venezuela, Ecuador, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Mexico, Singapore, ICRC. Mozambique.
Very much, Madam President. It will be difficult for me to speak after two brilliant interventions. So let me start by thanking you, Madam President, for the introductory remarks you made introducing this cluster of issues. My initial intention was to have a general provision entitled scope, general scope of the treaty. And that scope would state the general obligation to prohibit nuclear weapons, and here we could bring leading towards their total elimination. But probably with the drafting of Article 1, we no longer need that kind of provision, probably. let me address the statement made by Ambassador of Iran regarding the possible definition of terms. I must admit this is a very good idea. The only problem is that it would take us a lot of time trying to find a consensus language to define all these provisions, A, B, C, D, E, F. So I think that once again, interpretation of treaties would play an important role. So additionally, we do not have definition of terms in CTBT and in NPT. And this treaty, I think, should go more or less along the lines of these two important treaties. Now, on the merger of paragraph 1 and 2 of Article 1, I would like to agree with the distinguished representative of Sweden on this. But my personal opinion right from the beginning was, okay, let us read very carefully the provisions, but keep them for the time being apart. Let us not rush in merging. Let us first see and streamline the text, and at the end, probably we could bring them together. So, but I am not opposed as a matter of principle. Madam President, let me support a few positions. There are so many good proposals around the table, but let me support one, the obligation to destroy, stated by Costa Rica. And this is a very important provision. And two, the prohibition to engage in military preparations. In this case of nuclear weapons, I think it was proposed by Indonesia, and we would support that. Indonesia told us that it's drawing this idea from 11C of Chemical Weapons Convention. And on the threat, on the use or threat of use, I was reluctant to accept this idea, but reading carefully the Charter, Article 1, Article 39, I think that to some extent, prohibiting the threat of use is an extension or it derives from the prohibition of use or threat of use of force, as well as threat to peace. So I think that my delegation would accept that idea of prohibiting threat of use. Let me finally support Austria on the question of finance. And once again here, it is very difficult to spell out everything in a convention. Some of those things have to be derived by interpretation of the treaty, according to the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. But it would be very difficult to make it effective if we prohibited just in general terms financing. But of course, I don't have a very strong position on that. I could be convinced to the contrary if it so appears. So these are my comments Madam President, and once again to say that we have so many good proposals on the table, and I think that you will be able to assemble them and present us a very good text in a few days. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Mozambique. I now give the floor to the delegation of Venezuela, followed by Ecuador and Bangladesh. Thank you very much, Madam President. We would like to thank delegations for their very many contributions, which cover a lot of the things that our delegation would like to see reflected in this part of the text. With regard to the proposals made by various delegations, we'd like to support the proposal made in letter A with regard to including design and research and also destruction of nuclear weapons. And we also support the proposal made by Indonesia with regard to military preparations. That should also be included in this section, as well as the reference in letter B mentioned by Cuba of subcritical tests. With regard to D, we support the inclusion made by Iran with regard to the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And here we'd also like to support the proposal made by Liechtenstein to change this, the beginning of this article in order to reflect the goal of this committee, which is to prohibit the use of nuclear weapons. I think that's all for the moment. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la...
Thank you very much to the delegation of Venezuela. I give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador, followed by Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Mexico. Thank you very much, Madam President. It's interesting to come back into the second round of negotiations, but I think that helps things to be more interactive, and I certainly welcome that. The first thing I forgot to say when I took the floor before was to add something that my delegation mentioned during the first week of our session, and that relates to letter E. And like Venezuela and Cuba, I think we need to include subcritical tests as well in 1E. Certainly, the language of the CBT signed and ratified by Ecuador and which covers 2 monitoring systems, in fact, does this. And we have to be very careful with our language. But this treaty does give us an opportunity to go a little further without weakening the CNTBT, which unfortunately hasn't come into force. But we can add another element which is important, and that is the continued existence of nuclear tests. And it's no surprise that the nuclear weapon states, the 5 signatories of the NPT, not signed it, but not all have ratified the full Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. They wanted to ban certain tests, but not the subcritical tests. That's why we need to ban them here, because those tests certainly fly in the face of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And now I'd like to refer to transit. Several people have referred to this. I didn't refer to it in my first intervention because I think the best place to put it would be in the second part of the text, but since it's been mentioned, I'll refer to it. We have to think of countries that have difficulties if they have a lot of archipelagos, and there is a precedent for transit. Some of us will remember this in the arms trade treaty, but here specifically, when it comes to the nuclear subject, this is covered in the physical protection of nuclear materials. And that might give us a solution. I'll read out the text in English. It's Article 4, number 3 of that convention, and I'll read the first part of it. It says,
"Will not allow the transit of on its territory by land or internal waterways or through its airports or seaports of nuclear material, etc." So, así que, si hemos...
Therefore, if we've been able to prohibit transit of nuclear material, that could be just a small capsule, maybe. It doesn't have to be a big nuclear weapon. Why are we being told now that it's impossible to prohibit this? Of course, if you're talking about a submarine, I mean, that's what submarines do. They don't want to be detected. That's the military nature of them. If a plane flies over at 40,000 feet, how will we know about that? But I think this is why we need to keep adjusting the text with regard to transfer. But if a state is a state party to the Test Ban Treaty and would allow transit through their airports or ports of a ship or an aircraft that had a nuclear weapon, that would be wrong, and that would have to be prohibited. And then the second point is the division that we have in the paragraph and the relationship to Article 7. And of course, we'd like to see all of the proposals in all of the sections, but we do think that they should be kept separate. They talk about different things. Article 7 is a frequent article in these kinds of instruments, and it refers to the transfer of these obligations to domestic legislation, and including criminal legislation. And it's a very interesting discussion that we can have about the threat of use. And this is mentioned in the Charter, as the distinguished ambassador of Mozambique just pointed out. It's in the Charter, it's in the advisory opinion, it's common language that we've used so many times in political declarations. And now we've been told that it can't be included. Well, if there is a... I think you should be able to include this, and that this would be through extended nuclear alliances, even if you don't possess the weapons themselves. This is clearly related to deterrence, and certainly this is why we want to make sure that the threat of use is included in the text. Thank you.
Gracias, Ecuador.
Thank you, Ecuador. Now I'd like to give the floor to the delegation of Bangladesh, to be followed by Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this point, it's a bit difficult not to be repetitive, so please bear with us. We just wanted to make 4 specific points. Firstly, as a number of delegations have said, and echoing the point we also made during the March session, we would like to see prohibition of the threat of use of nuclear weapons here. And in that context, we also see merit in addressing the issue of military preparations and planning of use of nuclear weapons. Secondly, the issue of assistance. We understand that it is captured in a broad sense, especially by the phrase "in any way." Accordingly, we would perhaps hesitate a little bit to qualify assistance by means of technologies or financing or any such issues. and would encourage delegations who have made such proposals to perhaps give those ideas some second thought. Thirdly, we would also have some reluctance to specify issues concerning research and design. And we would perhaps agree with the distinguished Austrian delegation that the idea of development does cover these issues of research and design, and we should also be mindful of the possible implication of using these terms. We would, however, like to support the Swedish proposal or perhaps also the Swiss proposal to have a proviso clause regarding peaceful or civilian use of nuclear energy. And fourth and lastly, we would appreciate if the Secretariat or others could possibly respond to the Swiss question regarding the issue of retention, why retention has not been used in the list of prohibitions. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you to the delegation of Bangladesh. Indonesia has the floor, to be followed by Mexico, Singapore, the ICRC, and Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize for taking the floor again, and I'll keep my intervention very short. First of all, I'd like to thank previous delegations who have expressed their support for our proposals. And secondly, Madam President, I still need some time to look into the idea of having a unification of Article 1.1 and Article 1.2. Firstly, I think the argument was very eloquently expressed by the distinguished delegation of Sweden, where our paragraph 1.1 addresses the obligation of state party to undertake under any circumstances, whereas 1.2 indicates and stresses the need for a state party to undertake to prohibit and prevent any actions within its territory. So these are two completely different chapeaux, which has two sets of obligations which needs to be undertaken. So having said that, my delegation still needs some time to really look at the merit of the proposal of unifying these two sections. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam President.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. I now give the floor to the delegation of Mexico. Thank you very much, Madam President. My delegation is taking the floor once again to refer to some of the proposals that have been made. First of all, we would like to support the deletion that Sweden proposed. That is the deletion of E. We believe that the prohibition expressed in this is already covered by the CTBT, irrespective of the fact that it hasn't yet entered into force. It should also be said, for the same reasons, we believe it's appropriate to delete B of paragraph 2b. As to including financing in F, we believe that this is already dealt with under assistance in this same part, so we don't believe it's necessary to go into that detail. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mexico. Singapore has the floor, to be followed by ICRC. Singapore.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'll be very brief since we are approaching 6 on a Friday evening. Firstly, we support the general approach that has been taken in formulating this cluster. We also want to express our appreciation to colleagues who have tabled various good proposals, which we will take back to consider. The proposals and the exchange of views has been very stimulating, and we certainly would look at the proposals in greater detail. As a general point, we share the view that has been expressed that we should be careful to strike a careful balance between an aspirational document and also one that is verifiable. The practical realities have to be taken into account and cannot be ignored. Our view is that the objective should be clear, concise, and simple. And for these reasons, we actually support the points that have been raised by Austria. Moving on to the list of references in Article 1. On paragraph E, we support the proposal that has been made by Cuba on subcritical test. On D, we support Iran on the threat of use. Our perspective on 1F is similar to Switzerland, that we do not, there does not appear to be international consensus when it comes to the scope of a provision when it, regarding assistance, encouraging or inducing. And this is manifested in the declarations that have been made to similar disarmament treaties. We are open to various proposals that have been made to take our work on this forward, including by Sweden, Iran, and we look forward to working constructively with other delegations. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Singapore. I give the floor now to the ICRC.
Thank you, Madam President. Article 1 sets out the prohibitions and represents, in our view, the core of this convention. In our view, the provision is fairly robust, and as drafted, it prohibits the use of nuclear weapons and a wide range of activities that enable their use. One of the additional elements which we proposed in our working paper was to include a prohibition on the engagement in any military preparations to use nuclear weapons, and we're glad to see that a number of delegations have supported the inclusion of that prohibition in the draft. We thought there was value in this in drawing upon the language of the CWC, and to be honest, when we first put the idea of this prohibition into our paper, we thought this might be one way to try and deal with some aspects of the threat of use issue that has been so widely discussed this morning. As you may remember from the March meeting, we had encouraged the paper to take a rather practical approach to prohibiting threat of use, or at least encompassing threat of use in its prohibitions, and that this could be done by effectively making the prohibitions as broad as possible and prohibiting such a wide range of activity that in fact the threat of use of nuclear weapons would become virtually meaningless. So we're glad to see that there's been support for prohibiting military preparations to use nuclear weapons. An additional point I'd like to make is, or maybe ask the question, is it with regard to Articles 1.1c and 1.1g. And these, in fact, deal with the first one, receiving the transfer or control of nuclear weapons, which is 1.1c, and 1.1g, which covers or prohibits seeking or receiving any assistance to engage in any prohibited activity. And given the wide range of activities and actions that are already covered by Article 1, and indeed the additional ones which have been proposed by many states, we question the need for these provisions. In our view, it seems per se that if any state is receiving the transfer of control of over a nuclear weapon, or is receiving any assistance to engage in a prohibited act, per se that state is engaging in a prohibited activity covered by Article 1A. So we were just questioning whether or not these provisions about receiving or seeking to receive the transfer or assistance were actually needed in the convention, given the wide range of prohibitions that are included already, and indeed the additional activities that have been proposed by a number of states. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the International Committee of the Red Cross. Malaysia has the floor. They will be followed by Cuba and Algeria. Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam President, for the floor. At the March session, Malaysia, together with many other delegations here, had made interventions to state our views on each potential prohibition. Many of the questions we posed then, we believe, have considered these views very effectively. As such, we are supportive of the range of potential prohibitions introduced by the President. Some minor observations for consideration. First, on paragraph 1C, we view receiving a transfer as synonymous with acquiring, which is already clearly stated in 1A. As such, we are in support of streamlining this paragraph, as was also noted by the Distinguished Ambassador of Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And finally, we are obliged to seek further clarification on the language to prohibit the threat of use, even more so now in light of what the Distinguished Ambassador of Switzerland had said in her intervention and the circumspect views regarding implementation of this instrument as was raised by the Distinguished Ambassador of Austria earlier. While the threat of use is a gap which the ICJ identified in its 1996 advisory opinion, it was unable to come up with a clear ruling on whether the threat of use is illegal. For the purpose of this instrument then, in our desire to better understand and positively welcome this reference, how would state parties to this instrument make a clear legal case when it comes to implementation of this? We would be grateful to hear how future state parties here would prohibit threat as threat without actual use's intent, which then becomes particularly legally difficult under international law. With this, I thank you.
Thank you to Malaysia. Cuba has the floor, to be followed by Algeria. Cuba. Thank you very much, Madam President. My delegation would like to express its support to the proposal to include a prohibition on the financing in 1F, that is before assist finance. We believe that it would be valid in terms of existing norms to include a prohibition on the financing in this subparagraph. As to the various proposals to merge 1 and 2 of Article 1, we believe more time is really needed to take a decision on this, but what is established here the standards here are different in 1 and 2, the norms. In 2, we would have specific proposals to make. We understand that the proposal was to be made under 1, but there's a number of delegations who've made proposals under 2, which, if you allow me, we'd like to have our proposed amendments under 2 recorded. So in place of territory, after territory, we should have including
and waters.
Territory including its airspace and waters. So allow me to read it completely in English.
State party undertakes to prohibit and prevent in its territory, comma, including its airspace and waters, y continúa.
And then would continue.
Based on its jurisdiction or control. Nosotros consideramos que
we believe that there should be a prohibition and we should prevent that the states parties should have in their territorial waters and in their airspace, they should prohibit the transit of this type of weapon, and therefore in 1A we propose to add the following in English.
Storage, transit, transshipment. Son nuestras propuestas.
So as our proposal in this sentence would read as follows.
Storage, transit, transshipment, stationing, installation, or deployment of any nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Y en el 1A como
and in 1A, as we'd said, in 1A, in 1.2A, we'd include
by. O sea que quedaría any nuclear weapon test, including by explosion or any other nuclear explosion. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Le agradezco la delegación.
I'd like to thank the delegation of Cuba. As the last request to take the floor, we have Algeria.
Thank you, Madam. Madam Chair, regarding the Article 1 and general obligation, at the moment my delegation would like to support the inclusion of threat of use in Article 1D. The other prohibition, we will be coming back to them in next week. Thank you, Madam.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Algeria. So we just have 1 minute to go before 6 p.m. So we do need, therefore, to adjourn. We'll leave the delegation of Brazil, who's asked also for the floor. We leave them till Monday. But first and foremost, allow me to refer to something which is relevant. It's the request by many delegations to have the opportunity to look at what is being proposed, what has been proposed over these 2 days of work. Therefore, all those who can present these proposals that you've made in the room, if you can send them by email. So on Monday, they'll be on the website. And we will also distribute a compilation of all the documents to the email addresses of the delegations of the first committee. So allow me also to say that on Monday we will continue with the first article. I think we'll begin study of the next cluster, 2 to 5, on Monday. We've been striving to organize a side event with UNODA. I believe you've received a flyer with the invitation so that you can attend this specialized technical event concerning different aspects of verification of the elimination of nuclear programs. That is for Monday in conference room 1 at 1:15. So in this same room, I believe you received the flyer, so I don't need to dwell on that any further now. Allow me also to remind delegations who have not yet done so that they can submit the credentials to Legal Affairs as soon as possible, the Office of Legal Affairs. And at the same time, if one delegation would like to check whether the Secretariat has received their credentials, the Secretariat of the conference will update the information on the credentials which have been submitted by the Office of Legal Affairs. With that, I'd like to adjourn today's meeting, these first 2 days of the conference. We'd like to thank you for your work, your intense, diligent work, and congratulate you on the progress. Congratulate us all on the progress we've had. We'll resume on Monday, beginning at 10 a.m. in this same room, continuing our consideration of Article 1. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.
Without discrimination, to develop, acquire, and use nuclear technology, equipment, and materials for the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and to determine their peaceful nuclear programs in accordance with their national priorities, needs, and interests, bearing in mind the need to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. This, full stop, this is the paragraph. It comes from the outcome document of SSOD1, is OP 36. For us, it is regarding the peaceful of energy, we consider it as a sovereign and inalienable right to the states to develop their national capacities to use this kind of energy for peaceful purposes in order to contribute to the economy and social development of the states. I thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you very much to Algeria. I give the floor now to the delegation of Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the opportunity to raise some last points before closing this cluster of the preamble. I would just like to flag that very much along the lines of the distinguished delegate of Algeria, we would see some value in adding some a general recognition, let's say, in the preamble that the treaty should not constrain the legitimate interests in a number, so going beyond just the peaceful use of nuclear energy in a number of areas. This is, of course, the legitimate use of nuclear energy, as just mentioned by Algeria, but also the cooperation in other areas like trade, research, etc. Military cooperation, of course, is one of them, as we see some legitimacy of security cooperation that should be not restrained by this treaty. I don't have, for the time being, text or wording language to propose, but we can come back if you think it's useful. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the delegation of Thailand, to be followed by Brazil and Cuba. Thailand.
Thank you, Madam President. Just as an overall a remark, we would like to echo delegations who advocated stressing the humanitarian side of this preamble. We in Thailand, we think this angle of human rights is very important. The victim of nuclear weapons, they deserve protection and should enjoy their rights regardless of whether or how they have been affected. Also, we would like to underline the importance of the issue of environmental protection and remediation. We view this from the perspective of sustainable development. It is our moral, social, and economic obligation to work towards the improvement of human lives and their livelihoods, which for us translate into the need to ensure the protection of their surroundings. Therefore, a stronger language in paragraphs 2 and 3 on these aspects would be desirable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Thailand. I now give the floor to the delegation of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In fact, we were going to make the exact same proposal that was made by Algeria on peaceful, inalienable.
I call to order the 14th meeting of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. The conference will now continue its consideration of Agenda Item 9 in Cluster 1, the preamble, and in the course of the afternoon, we will also begin consideration of Agenda Item 9 of Cluster 2, General Obligations. So I'd like now to give the floor to those delegations which would like to make general comments with regard to preamble, particularly those issues which they consider not to have been considered in the 14 paragraphs that are originally in the document. So I'd like to give the floor to the delegation of the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And first, allow me to thank you for your flexibility and the opportunity to make these additional points on para 1 to 5. On para 1, while highly appreciating the reference to humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, we would suggest to make an effort to stay in line with existing consensus NPT language. From our perspective, the paragraph would be improved and would be more broadly acceptable by omitting the words, quote, under any circumstances, at the end of the sentence. On para 2, as stated in our previous remarks, we are concerned that any reference to aspects relating to international security and stability is lacking in the current text, and addressing these issues is an important condition for progress on disarmament and essential in securing support of a broader group of states. The second preambular paragraph would offer an appropriate location to address these issues by including a clear reference to the NPT and the importance of security aspects of nuclear disarmament. And furthermore, we could support previous suggestions made, and I refer especially to our colleague from Sweden, made to improve the reference to gender aspects in this paragraph. On para 5, we would like to bring the text of the paragraph in line with the relevant 1996 ICJ opinion, and we will look forward to see and assess the proposals to improve the content and effect of this paragraph. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I'd like to thank the delegation of the Netherlands. I give now the floor to Algeria, to be followed by Switzerland and Thailand.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm not going to make a general observation on the preamble. I would like to mention that my delegation is highly appreciated if you can include the new paragraph, PP, concerning the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And in this case, however, just to let you know that my delegation is flexible for where to place this paragraph in the PPs. We are flexible in whatever the placement is. I'm just going to read the new PP. Reads as follows: reaffirming that measures of disarmament must be consistent with the inalienable right of all states.
Right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. We think this is a critical element that needs to be in the treaty to make it clear that the right that is recognized in several treaties, not just the NPT, on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy for several different purposes is not hampered by the Prohibition Treaty. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to Brazil. The delegation of Cuba has the floor, to be followed by Nigeria. Cuba. Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving my delegation the floor. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. My delegation would like to make two proposals for paragraphs. These are new paragraphs, 14. Basically, President, to highlight the fact that in implementing and designing instruments of disarmament, we should respect also the environmental agreements. So we propose paragraph 14 bis, which says as follows in English.
So the need to comply with relevant environmental norms in the implementation of this convention.
Now, this proposal, Madam President, is based on operative paragraph 1 of GA Resolution 7160. It was a consensus-based resolution of the GA, and my delegation believes that it would be very useful that in the preamble to this convention, that reference should be made. Now, the other delegation, the other resolution that we'd like to submit is very closely linked to what was said by Algeria and Brazil, basically in order to highlight that nothing in this convention should violate the inalienable rights of states to the peaceful use of nuclear power. So the language of the proposal from Cuba is as follows in English.
Emphasizing that nothing in this convention should be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of its states parties to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President.
Le agradezco.
I'd like to thank the delegation of Cuba. We have now the delegation of Nigeria, who's asked for the floor. Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President. It is just to broadly endorse the proposal by the delegate of Algeria on the issue of peaceful uses. And we particularly love the reference to SSOD1. And then just to also say that the readout by Cuba on the appropriate language will be studied as well. But it appears they are all falling in line. I thank you.
Thank you very much to the delegation. The delegation of South Africa has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to colleagues. My delegation would like to add its voice of support to the proposal as made by Algeria, Brazil, and Cuba. And we particularly...
I think I have a wording for you to consider, and that is to recognize the importance of disarmament education in all its aspects, and of the awareness raising on the risk and consequences of nuclear weapons for current and future generation. And my proposal would be, after that, including through the commemoration of the International Day of the total elimination of nuclear weapon on 26 September. I would be happy to provide them in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Indonesia. Now it does appear that we have come to the end of the list of speakers. And so we can now give the floor to the organizations of civil society for a 15-minute section. So we'll begin with Ms. Lynette Gaillou, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Madam President, the preamble, we believe, must clearly convey the enormous and ever-increasing risk that nuclear weapons, through their very existence, pose to all humankind. This risk will remain until the weapons have been completely eradicated. The preamble must, moreover, acknowledge the inability of the international community to render any meaningful humanitarian relief in the aftermath of a nuclear detonation, a key conclusion of the 3 humanitarian conferences. The draft language on the gendered impacts of nuclear explosions should be broadened to reflect more accurately recent research findings in this area. Such impacts have a social, economic, cultural, as well as physical dimension. It is important, too, that the preamble recognize the disproportionate impact that nuclear testing has had and continues to have on indigenous communities around the world. Their lands, rivers, and oceans have been poisoned. They have been permanently displaced from their homes, disconnected from their way of life and culture, in addition to their lives being ruined. State parties should resolve in the preamble to do their utmost to provide assistance to all victims of nuclear weapons and to remediate all environments affected by the use, testing, and development of nuclear weapons. They should stress that in a world where basic human needs have not yet been met, the vast resources allocated to the manufacture and modernization of nuclear arsenals must be directed towards social and economic development. They should welcome the broad support for the international norms prohibiting other indiscriminate weapons, including biological weapons, chemical weapons, anti-personnel landmines, and cluster munitions. They should emphasize the desirability of attracting the adherence of all states to the treaty and express their determination to work strenuously towards the promotion of its universalization and full implementation. Above all else, we hope that the preamble will be more powerfully conveyed to the world our collective unequivocal rejection not only of the use of nuclear weapons, but also of their mere possession by...
Would look interestingly the addition by Cuba. And we will take your request, Madam President, that we will submit our portion together with the ones from Brazil and Cuba. We will try and see if we can agree together, and then we'll submit something to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the delegation of South Africa. There are no further delegations requesting to take the floor. Oh, yes, we have two delegations requesting the floor. Mexico to be followed by Iran. Mexico.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. We would simply like to support what was said by the delegations of Algeria, Cuba, and Brazil concerning the appropriate inclusion here of a reference to the peaceful uses of nuclear power.
Muchas gracias, México. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much, Mexico. Iran to be followed by Venezuela. Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, since we are still considering the preambular part, I would like to make this short comment regarding the title of the document. I would like to support the view expressed by South Africa regarding the title of the treaty, this document. I think treaty is more relevant to this document than convention or anything else. On the peaceful use of nuclear energy, I do support Cuba and others who suggested to have a paragraph in preambular part, but I think since this issue is very important, according to that paragraph that we are going to insert in the preambular part, we need to have one paragraph in the operational part in the commitments of states. Thank you. Then later on we will discuss that.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the delegation of Venezuela to be followed by Indonesia. Venezuela.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon to all colleagues. Our delegation would also like to add our voice to the support expressed by Algeria and Brazil and Cuba. This concerns the inclusion of a paragraph that would refer to the inalienable right of all states to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Delegation of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. Just as a general remarks on the preamble part, I'll keep it short. I think what we have been listening thus far since yesterday has been very constructive, and I think we would rely on your judgment and wisdom on how to construct the preambular part. But I do appeal to you that once once the draft on the preamble are being put together, I do appeal to you to keep in mind on the need to delegitimize nuclear weapons as an object, as well as delegitimizing nuclear deterrence as a concept. So that's my general statement on the preamble part. And secondly, I'm sorry to take this floor again to use this opportunity to. I had a language that was proposed based on the Irish new paragraph on 14 bis.